Today's episode is presented by Lodestar, the fee experts.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Lodestar's Lending Leaders. This week, I'm joined by Dominique Wiest from LendingPad. She's the VP of Regulatory Compliance, and I'm really excited to dive into this today. So thank you so much, Dominique, for joining me.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So you filled quite a few different roles, both in and out of the mortgage industry throughout the year. We were talking about that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your journey into the mortgage industry. How did you end up here?
So I actually worked in the real estate industry working at a law firm. My first degree is in paralegal. So that's where I kind of was in the beginning. And through just opportunities, ended up going to work for a small, I would say a regional lender, and went into their compliance. They needed somebody that did compliance, and I had a lot of experience in the closing area. So they invited me to come meet the team, and I did, and ended up being their closing manager. And then eventually it kind of morphed into a regional closing manager. So that was really my inroads into compliance and the mortgage industry at the same time.
Yeah. And you've been in compliance for quite a while, just over 20 years. While we think this is a basic question, I think it's important to also recognize what specifically is compliance in the mortgage industry and why should lenders care so much about it?
Well, compliance is something that can really end up being a huge risk to the lender if you don't pay attention to it. Obviously, not only just legal ramifications of not having a loan that's compliant with a state or a federal regulation, but a lot of investors will cause you to buy the loans back or not insure them or something like that. So compliance is, from a lender's perspective, is extremely risky not to know the laws in the state that you're doing business in. Mm-hmm. and what the rules are for the investors. So it's not just state requirements. There's a lot of requirements actually that are investor requirements as well that fall in that kind of compliance bucket.
Mm-hmm. And coming from, a mortgage lender to being the head of compliance at an LOS platform, how do you view compliance differently in those two very different roles, right? One is responsible for compliance of a specific company. The other is creating kind of standards for people to follow.
Well, the good thing is that I've had so much experience in the federal and the kind of state compliance roles that I have a really good idea of what regulatory agencies are looking at, which is one of the buckets that are, really important that you have to make sure you're compliant with. And to create those rules that will help remind the user, there's tons of calculations that take place. And these calculations are not simple A plus B equals C type calculations. Some of them use very detailed information. And to do that is extremely cumbersome for the user to know how to do that manually. Basically, a compliance engine, regardless of which one you use, can run those calculations very accurately, very fast. And as long as you understand the math behind it, and you can check the math of that engine, then you are sure that the math is going to be done correctly, right? And it just speeds up the amount of time that it takes you to run these engines. Because think about it, every disclosure that you give that's compliance related has a number. The loan estimates have, I think, 5. The CD has 7, and that's just the main, on the back page. These are your milestones, if you will, for compliance. And to run that on every single disclosure for every single loan, I've seen in the regulatory world as many as 15 disclosures for one loan. Think about how many hours you would spend doing that. That's just, it's
absolutely crazy,
mind-boggling, to be honest. And that's why I personally was so excited when we first started getting the access to the first compliance engines. And that was because you could run these calculations extremely fast. And it was being run basically the same way for each kind of loan. So if you had a fixed rate loan that went through, you could depend that if you'd compared the fixed rate loan and knew how the engine was calculating it, that you could rely on it. And that's what I did when I actually was at the bureau and I was in systems. When, an examiner would say to me, how do you know it's accurate? I'd say, run it manually. Run it, and this is kind of old school, but run it with your HP12C and figure out manually, compare it. That's what's going to give you the assurance to understand whether it's running correctly or not to just rely on it without having checked it.
Yeah. And I think you touched on this a little bit in your last statement so you've been in both the role as an examiner for the state of North Carolina and then also in the CFPB role. You talk a little bit about that, but what knowledge do you feel like that gave you to kind of bring into this role? Because both of those are, very unique and exciting roles.
Yeah, at the state, you concentrate mostly on the state regulations. Different states look at the federal regulations differently. Some run both state and federal. At the federal level, you're pretty much just interested in the federal regulations. So you may look at a different set of rules, right? And kind of similar as a compliance officer, you may look at a certain set of rules that you feel like are risky for your products that you give out that you want to manage. And it's basically the same thing. When I went to the federal, the CFPB role, I was an examiner, just like I was in the state of North Carolina, but it morphed into a systems analyst position in headquarters, partially because I did understand compliance and they needed someone to help the examiners who didn't have experience with these compliance tools to be able to use them accurately and to know that these results are accurate so that it speeds up the time. It doesn't it shouldn't be changing the outcome. It should be the same outcome, but it just faster. And so I ended up in the systems department as an analyst, to help mostly the examiners understand that. And then that morphed into just other systems that I wanted, that they wanted me to support.
Yeah. And so throughout your experience, how do you feel that compliance has evolved? What do you think was the moment that gave it the biggest impact? In technology or even in a regulation or anything like that?
Yeah. So I would say from my experience, the largest shift took place when they kind of changed the rules of the road. So when we went from good faith estimates and HUD-1s to LEs and CDs, I would say it's probably the largest shift. It also was the most impactful in the technology industry because, there was an entire industry built around certain disclosures, and to not only change the disclosure to, for the customer's benefit, that was the point of it, right? To change it for the customer's benefit so they could better understand what they were looking at. And then to kind of add to that, some industry changes that had taken place in 2010, which it adds some tolerance stuff and some timing stuff. They even added more to it to make it a little bit more clear to the customer when certain things are going to take place and to add a little bit more, I would say, transparency to the whole process to the consumer. And I think the combination of both of those shifts is what has had the hugest impact on our industry. I think because of that, it made compliance obviously more stringent, but it made compliance engines become more and more important because, again, there's just more stuff you have to check and it takes more time. And to have a compliance engine that is speeding up the pieces that you need to speed up is extremely important.
Yeah. I mean, we're one of those businesses that was born out of, the TRID regulation, the LECD kind of thing. That's all we do, right? And I think there's dozens of other businesses that are in that kind of category as well. So I think you're 100% correct there. And I think one thing that's really interesting is, technology kind of, you have to build this trust right? It's kind of that black box I think a lot of people are talking about right now with AI. I'm sure it was very similar when this technology first rolled out, is it felt like it was going into a black box and you just didn't know what was happening in there.
Yes. You know, I'm not sure how all compliance engines are addressing that issue, but personally in ours, we're actually trying to be more transparent in the explanations that we give. And so, for example, if that calculation is based in or around a loan amount. So if a loan amount is higher or lower than a certain, and it causes a different percentage trigger in a threshold, then we put, this is the loan amount, this is the threshold, so that the user understands this is why it's 8% versus 6%, or, you know, whatever the threshold is. And I think that's what's going to help open up the black box, as you call it. Like, you're right. Like that's probably going to be most every user's biggest question is, how do I know this calculation is accurate? And again, like, as difficult as it is, I would say you really need to go back to understanding how to do it manually, so that you understand this engine should be speeding it up, not necessarily training you how to do it. And AI is kind of the same way, right? It doesn't know what to do unless you train it. And I think that's where the comfort level comes, is understanding that I know how to do it and I can check it if I have a question.
Yeah.
And that all the variables are there so that I can look at them and make sure that I agree with those variables.
So what would you say the biggest thing, you know, in your career has taught you about compliance that you think most lenders don't understand or don't know? You know, you have a lot of experience with it.
I would say probably the one thing that's the most elusive is the value in that information. So the value in the exact property address, or the value in some piece, the exact terms of that loan, that can affect so many different pieces to the process that person who's inputting that loan, I don't think they really understand how valuable they are to get it right to begin with. And, you know, I worked at a lender, which I'm not going to say the name, but I worked at that lender for multiple years in multiple different roles. And I saw that one piece of information being critical in different places that I'm sure the user that was sitting there putting it in didn't have any idea how critical that loan approval could turn on that number or that piece of information. The you know, accuracy of the title work could turn on that, because I've actually, you know, managed a title company. So it's amazing how much information it can be critical in these mortgage loans, in not just, you know, the origination compliance, but like how they perform after the fact.
100%. So as we wrap up here today, I'm going to ask our favorite question so a lodestar is a guiding light in the night sky. So we're big about celebrating the things that inspire us. What do you consider a lodestar or an inspiration in either your professional or personal career? We like to give people the option to pick one.
You know, honestly, probably for me personally, it's the same thing. Just follow your passion. Whatever you're really interested in. And I tell my friends and my, you know, grandchildren, believe it or not, I have grandchildren. Like, I tell them because, you know, everybody's trying to figure out where they fit and to do something, especially nowadays, do something you like doing. My husband will say, and I've said many times, if you do what you love, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like you're accomplishing something. And it's very fulfilling. And I think that's probably my guiding star here, is just follow your passion. If you love something, no matter if you get a lot of money for it or not at the time, just follow it, because an opportunity will arise that you'll end up using it and it will really benefit you. And it'll never feel like work to you. It'll always feel like fun. I mean, I go to work every day because it's just fun. I'm not saying that's no stress ever, but you enjoy it and it's worth it.
Yeah. I think that's great to be able to come home and just be proud of what you've done during your work day and feel that sort of satisfaction from it in your personal life. Well, honestly,
I just wanted to say one thing, and that is, I'm doing what I'm doing here at LendingPad because I was at a level where I could see the need for it. Like not just people that were regulating, but like in the industry this itself, like I could see the need for it. And that's why I said, I have the ability, albeit this is going to be a stretch even for me because there's so much regulation out there. But if there's this huge gap that needs to be filled, then you just have to do it if you have the ability.
Yeah, I think that's honestly a very admirable and a beautiful thing to do is when you have the capability to do something and to better an industry, you should definitely take advantage of it. So as we wrap up here today, where can people find you?
LendingPad.
Perfect. LendingPad. Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dominique, for joining me today for this lovely episode. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll see everyone next week. Please subscribe and share with your friends. And we can't wait to see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Lodestar's Lending Leaders podcast. Please like, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars anywhere you get your podcasts. A special thank you to the Lodestar podcast production team, Jim Paolino, Tim Austin, and John Gardner.